session in which we will primarily discuss idealism. But first, we should once again consider the role that philosophy plays. To arrive at a more complete understanding of our world and the choices we need to make, we need to answer the adverb questions how, where, why, when, to what degree. Is it worth the effort? I think so. Without a philosophy of teaching or life for that matter, we are rudderless. To help us ask and answer the right questions, we can look at what past and present wise men and women have had to say. We can summarize their ideas in grouping or categories. Since these groupings are usually somewhat forced, they may not be 100% accurate. However, this activity may be helpful in summarizing the various approaches to life's and educational questions. The answer to this question varies from individual to individual. There are common answers like family, religious, faith, a band of brothers, and freedom. In short, some of us have ideas we hold so important that we would die for them. In the classroom, regardless of the type, we should have ideals we think are important to live by and develop them in our students. Human beings seem to be unique in terms of ability and propensity to develop, live by, and die for others' ideals. The first group of philosophers we will study are the idealists. Though idealism predated Plato, he is considered the most powerful spokesperson for this philosophy. In summary, idealists believe there are ideals worth dying for and teaching to children. These are absolute and never changing. They have been revealed to us either through divine revelation or through the insights of extraordinary thinkers. Education is a matter of developing in the young an appreciation for these revelations and for a few, developing in them the ability to think deeply about life's questions. Truth consisted of seeing how the collection of past wisdom is still relevant in the everyday affairs of the world. Before you go on with this PowerPoint, please read the allegory of the supplemental reading. There are two worlds for the idealists. For past idealists and those who are religious today, there are literally two worlds. Other modern idealists, they see the second world in figurative terms. From both literal and figurative perspectives, one world is the world of shadows. This is the world in which most of us live. We see things darkly with the reality only hinted at. The other world is the world of perfection, where the ideals exist in their real form. What we see on earth are poor reflections of the inborn knowledge of the ideal we have. We all have the ideal in mind, but are often disappointed by the real. Plato thought that babies were the smartest form of life because their souls had only recently been plucked out of the world of ideals. They would eventually lose this knowledge and be forced to live and understand reality in our terms. The reason they can do nothing more than babble was that human speech was inadequate to express reality. Like the person who escapes from the cave, sees reality, and is recaptured, that person can never be satisfied with the shadows again. He or she eventually is thought mad by peers and is murdered by the authorities, as was Plato's teacher Socrates. The purpose of education is to help us remember what we already know. You're probably thinking that Plato's ideals are not that unfamiliar to us. That is because in some form or another, his ideals are still around today. Some of this is by the direct impact of his writings on Western thought, especially the epistles of Paul, and some because later thinkers came to the same conclusions on their own. In the ideal government that he outlined in The Republic, Plato argues that everyone has a notch to fill and people should be happy in their inherited notch and do their best in that place. Today, many businesses, the military, the mafia, and some churches are organized in this fashion, as are most civil governments throughout most of human history. The democratic ideals coming out of the Renaissance have challenged this structure, but have not eliminated it. Many people today in various parts of the world, including the United States, think a little democracy and a little more Plato might be better. A key to Plato's idea of a stratified world was his view that we inherited a certain nature, and this could not change. Kings produced kings, serfs produced serfs. This attitude continues today. If you have not said it yourself, I'm sure you have heard another teacher say it. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Or, I had his brother in school, so I'm sure we will have trouble with him as well. Educators are not the only ones who sometimes accept that heredity determines social status and achievement. We all know who will get the slap on the wrist, public service sentence, and who will get sent to reform school when a rich kid and poor kid go before the judge on the exact same charges. Plato explains his reasoning for his idea of regarding a stratified social structure in an allegory called the Allegory of the Metals. He pointed out that just as you would not make a sword from gold because it would not hold up in battle, nor a crown from iron because it would be ugly and rust, so people born from slaves cannot be expected to make decisions regarding the ruling of the states. You make swords from iron and crowns from gold, because that is how it is ordained in nature. Until people like Locke, Voltaire, and Jefferson challenged this idea, most people, including those at the bottom of the social order, accepted their place. Current philosophers like Illich and Freire, who we will talk about later on, say those in poverty are still taught to stay in their place in too many societies, including our own. In the heredity versus environment conflict, Plato definitely comes down on the side of heredity. The premise behind the No Child Left Behind Act and other aspects of contemporary school organizations is that the environment is chiefly responsible for intellectual development. Therefore, it makes sense to put the student who used to be in special education classes into mainstreamed foreign language and even algebra classes. Under this view, native IQ doesn't matter. There is a growing grumble from educators and others that, in fact, inborn intelligence limitations cannot be wished away by mainstreaming. You can see in this current discussion that Plato is not as dead as you might have thought he was. Plato, like most philosophers and societal leaders up until about 200 years ago, thought education should be reserved for the ruling class. Since abstracts and knowledge about them do not change, the curriculum should consist of teaching what great men who came before have taught. Truth was cohered to what we already knew as true. Education also then should teach people how to think so they would see the truth of what was revealed already. This type of thinking seems foreign to our scientific minds, but we still see this advocated in the perennialism and essentialism movements today, which dominated the thinking of the Federal Department of Education leadership under the Reagan and Bush administrations. Getting back to Plato, he stressed the importance of learning math as a mental discipline and other mental gymnastics to train the mind for higher levels of contemplation. There is much evidence to indicate that the movement away from a rigorous curriculum filled with long-term papers, difficult math classes, and required Latin has resulted in a generation or two of people incapable of sustained thought. Of course, there are many who would present evidence to refute this. Though Plato lived so long ago, his ideas sound fresh to us because his ideas are foundational to Western political, religious, and philosophical thought. People take comfort in knowing and following the tested and the true. Once more, Christianity was interpreted to the Roman Gentile world of the 1st and 2nd century in Platonic terms, harshly through the writings of Paul, who was a Hellenist. It would make sense in proclaiming this new religion that he would use terms and concepts in which people were already familiar. Plato's emphasis of the soul over the body and anti-materialism echoes the themes we see in the epistles of Paul. The world of the ideals in which Plato speaks is similar in concept to the Judeo-Christian idea of heaven, which we all desire to return. Most biblical scholars readily acknowledge the providence provided by the Platonic world through the rapid spread of Christianity. Plato's contribution to Western intellectual life continued through the Renaissance and the Age of Reason, during which he inspired philosophers like Descartes, who advocated looking into ourselves for the answers to philosophical questions, just as Plato advised, through mental discipline and contemplation. One of the founders of modern educational philosophy, Rousseau, advanced the idea that it is inherited human nature with which the educator must foster growth and development, instead of manipulating the environment to make poor copies of ourselves instead of the almost divine people that we could be. These are but three of the hundreds of thinkers and leaders throughout the ages who owe a debt to the thoughts of Plato. Idealism is still alive and well in the world. The testing and standards movement is a direct result of the idea that there are things that educated persons should know and be able to do. The virtue ethics movement, evident in things like character counts programs, which you see are offered in almost all American primary and elementary classrooms, are based on the idealist perspective. As we review the chart on this slide and the other materials associated with this lesson, you'll see how many aspects in the field of education or in society reflect in idealist philosophy.